Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Jaswinder Kumar, Assistant Professor, University Institute of Hotel and Tourism Management, Punjab University, Chandigarh. Today, we will discuss about various interview methods used in research. The major objectives of this module are to understand about various interview methods used in research, to understand about the strengths and weaknesses of different types of interview methods, and to know about various ethical issues in interviews as research methods. Dear students, the interview is probably the most widely employed method in qualitative research. Interviewing, the transcription of interviews and the analysis of transcripts are all very time consuming, but they can be more readily accommodated into researchers' personal lives. An interview is a conversation for gathering information. A research interview involves an interviewer who coordinates the process of the conversation and asks questions, and an interviewee who responds to these questions. Interviews can be conducted face-to-face or over the telephone. The internet is also emerging as a tool for interviewing. Interviews are appropriate method when there is a need to collect in-depth information on people's opinions. There can be certain thoughts, experiences and feelings which are extracted through interviews. Interviews are useful when the topic of inquiry relates to issues that require complex questioning and considerable probing. Face-to-face interviews are suitable when the target population can communicate through face-to-face conversations better than they can communicate through writing or telephonic conversations, such as for children, elderly or disabled individuals it can be applied. Dear students, we know that data can be gathered from number of sources including written documents, records, workplaces, the internet, surveys and interviews. But we use 4 important types of interviews most of the times, such as structured interview, semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews and non-directive interviews. Interviews are a systematic way of talking and listening to people, and are another way to collect data from individuals through conversations. The researcher or interviewer often uses open questions. Data is then collected from the interviewee or respondent. The researcher needs to remember the interviewer's views about the topic is not of importance or is having much importance. The interviewee or the respondent is the primary source of giving the data. Interviewee may collect data as to gain knowledge from individuals. It is interchange of views between 2 or more people on a topic of mutual interest, sees the centrality of human interaction for knowledge production and emphasizes the social situations of research. Interviews are ways for participants to get involved and talk about their views. In addition, the respondents are able to discuss their perception and interpretation in regards to a given situation. Their expressions from the point of view related to the topic gives detailed explanation about a particular situation. The researcher has to know and select the appropriate method for addressing the needs of the research. Then the researcher has to make a decision and choose the right method for that particular study. Dear students, let us understand the characteristics of research interviews. Interviews are completed by the interpersonal transaction of words or feelings that relates to some outputs. Interviews are a far more personal form of research than questionnaires. In the personal interview, the interviewer works directly with the interviewee or respondent. Unlike the mail surveys, the interviewer has the opportunity to probe or ask follow-up questions. Interviews are generally easier for the interviewee, especially if what is sought are opinions or impressions. Interviews are time consuming and resource intensive. It needs much time to inquire variety of respondents. The interviewer is considered a part of measurement instrument and has to well trained in how to respond to any contingency. Interviews provide an opportunity of face-to-face interaction between different people. Hence, they reduce conflicts. Now, what are the reasons that researcher uses the interviews? There are many reasons to use interviews for collecting data and using it as a research instrument, as there is a need to attain highly personalized data. There are opportunities required for probing. A good return rate is possible in interview. Respondents are not fluent in the native language of the country, or where they have difficulties with the written language, then interview is preferred. It is necessary for researcher to prepare before the actual interview. The interview starts before the interview actually begins. This is the researcher's preparation stage. Once the interview is conducted, the researcher needs to make sure that the respondents have certain specifications or knowledge, such as a clear idea of why they have been asked or interviewed, basic information about the purpose of the interview and the research project of which it is a part. They should have some idea of the probable length of the interview and that the researcher is likely to record it, and it should be explained to the respondent. There should be a clear idea of precisely where and when the interview will take place. Also, the interview needs to be effective, and this is the responsibility of the researcher. The researcher should have certain skills and abilities to conduct research through interview, such as he should have ability to listen. Researcher should have ability to be non-judgmental. Researcher should have a good memory. And for this, the researcher should prepare a guide consisting of certain components to conduct interviews. The guide is the list of questions, topics and issues that the researcher wants to cover during the interview. The interview guide should be clear and avoid ambiguity. The researcher shouldn't ask personal or illegal questions and be comfortable with silences and wait for the respondent to speak. There are different ways of developing a guide which will assist the researcher, such as identify appropriate topics and questions which have to be asked, decide on the level of detail of the questions. After that, draft the questions and order the questions in a sequence. List any probes or prompts and pilot the questions. Have the informant identify the problems during the pilot study. Let us discuss about various types of interview methods. Prominent interview methods as number 1, structured interviews, number 2, semi-structured interviews, number 3, unstructured interviews, and number 4, non-directive interviews. First of all, structured interviews. A structured interview is also called a standardized interview. The same questions are asked for all respondents. Structured interviews are interviews in which all respondents are asked the same questions with the same wording and in the same sequence. It would be ideal if questions can be read out in the same tone of voice so that the respondents would not be influenced by the tone of the interviewer. The aim is for all interviewees to be given exactly the same context of questioning. This means that each respondent receives exactly the same interview stimulus as any other. The goal of this style of interview is to ensure that interviewees or respondent replies can be aggregated. Questions are usually very specific and very often the interviewee a fixed range of answers, and this type of questions is often called closed-ended, pre-coded or fixed choice questions. This type of interview introduces some rigidity to the interview. For example, probing can be a problem area for structured interviews. Respondents may not understand the question and unable to answer it. Moreover, respondents may not have received sufficient information to answer the question. The problem is either situation is obvious. The interviewer's intervention may influence the respondent and the nature of interviewer's ability in respondent's replies that does not reflect true variation. The strengths of structured interviews are that the researcher has control over the topics and the format of the interview. This is because a detailed interview guide is used. There is a common format. Consequently, if there is a common format which makes it easier to analyze, code and compare data. In addition, a detailed interview guide can permit inexperienced researchers to do a structured interview. Another strength of structured interview is that prompting can be included with the question, and if a question is inappropriate, data on why no response was made can be recorded. Further, non-verbal cues such as facial expressions, gestures can be recorded. On the other hand, the drawbacks of structured interviews are that they adhere too closely to the interview guide and may be the cause of not probing for relevant information. Also, there is a set of interview guide the respondents may hear and interpret or understand the question in a different manner. The researcher's verbal comments and non-verbal cues can cause bias and have an influence upon respondents' answers. Let us discuss about second method, that is semi-structured interviews. The semi-structured interviews are non-standardized and are frequently used in qualitative analysis. The interviewer does not do the research to test a specific hypothesis. The researcher has a list of key themes, issues and questions to be covered. In this type of interview, the order of the questions can be changed depending on the direction of the interview. An interview guide is also used, but additional questions can be asked. The order in which the various topics are dealt and the wording of the questions are left to the interviewer's discretion. Within each topic, the interviewer is free to conduct the conversation as he thinks fit, to ask the questions he deems appropriate in the words he considers best, and to give explanation and to ask for the clarification if the answer is not clear and to prompt the respondents to elucidate or explain further if necessary is the advantage from this type of interview. Here, additional questions can be asked, and some may be questions that have not been anticipated in the beginning of the interview. Note taking or tape recording documents the interview. This type of interview gives the researcher opportunities to probe for views and opinions of the interviewee. Probing is the way for the interview to explore new paths which were not initially considered. Having key themes and sub-questions in advance lies in giving the researcher a sense of order from which to draw questions from unplanned encounters. The researcher conducting semi-structured interviews is free one than conducting a structured interview in which the interviewer does not have to adhere to a detailed interview guide. The strengths of semi-structured interviews are that the researcher can prompt and probe deeper into the given situation, such as the interviewer inquires about using cell phones in booking of hotels. Some people are more efficient in smartphones than others. Hence, with this type of interview, the interviewers are able to probe or ask more detailed questions of respondents' situations, and no need to adhere only to the interview guide. In addition, the researcher can explain or rephrase the questions if respondents are unclear about the questions. The drawbacks are inexperienced interviewers may not be able to ask prompt questions. If this is the case, some relevant data may not be gathered. In addition, inexperienced interviewers may not probe into a situation. For example, if the respondents do not know how to use smartphones and do not want to use them in booking of hotels, the interviewer needs to probe and find out the reasons and ask for explanations. Next method is unstructured interviews. This type of interview is non-directed and is a flexible method. It is more casual than other interview methods. There is no need to follow a detailed interview guide. Each interview is different. The respondents are encouraged to speak openly, frankly, and give as much detail as possible. Usually, the interviewer has received virtually little or no training or coaching about the interview and its process, or if he has not prepared much, then also he can ask the questions. The interviewer asks questions that respondents would be able to express their opinions, knowledge, and share their experience. This can create some problems because the interviewer may not know what to look for or what direction to take the interview. The researcher may not obtain data that is relevant to the question of the study. This can be a drawback. The interviewer needs to think about what to ask and to ask questions carefully and phrase them properly and know when to probe and prompt. In an unstructured interview, the researcher has to be a good listener and note new or interesting data the interviewee gives. It requires good communication and facilitation skills. The strengths of unstructured interviews are no restrictions are placed on questions. It is useful when little or no knowledge exists about a topic. So, background data can be collected. Unstructured interviews are flexible and the researcher can investigate certain underlying motives. The drawbacks of unstructured interviews are that they can be inappropriate for inexperienced interviewers. The interviewer The interviewers may be biased and ask inappropriate questions. Also, respondents may talk about irrelevant and inconsequential issues. It may be difficult then to code and analyze the data. And the last one is the non-directive interviews. Dear students, the structured and semi-structured interviews that we discussed are somewhat controlled by the researcher who has set the issues and questions. In non-directive interviews, there are no preset topic to pursue. Questions are usually not pre-planned. The interviewer listens and does not take the lead. The interviewer follows what the interviewee or respondent has to say. The respondent leads the conversation. The interviewer has the objective of research in mind and what issues to cover during the interview. The interviewee is allowed to talk freely about the subject. The interviewer's role is to check on unclear points and to rephrase the answer to check for accuracy and understanding. The interviewer does not know which direction the interview will take. Non-directive interviews have their origin in dynamic psychology and psychotherapy, with the objective to help patients reveal their deep-seated and subconscious feelings. The strengths of non-directive interviews are to find the deep-rooted problems and the subconscious feelings. On the other hand, the drawbacks are that there are no directions or issues to explore, which can cause some problems in coding and analyzing the data. Okay, now let us understand if we need to conduct interview, what steps we should follow. Before the interview, define your objectives, identify what you want to achieve and the information you need to gather. Make sure an interview is the appropriate way to meet your objectives. Choose the type of interview, means review your required information, budget, time, and potential respondents and decide whether you need to conduct structured, semi-structured, unstructured, or non-directional interviews. After that, choose the appropriate respondents. Depending on the type of interview, decide on the characteristics of interviewees or respondents and the number of interviews required. The next step is to decide how to conduct the interview. Considering telephonic or face-to-face interviews, for large surveys consider computer-aided interviewing and recording. Next step is to decide how to recruit your respondents, and for this obtain contact information for a number of respondents larger than the number of interviews you need, since some may not respond. Contact them by telephonically through email or regular mail and introduce yourself, your organization and your project. Explain the purpose of the interview, the importance of their participation, and set up an appointment. After that, decide how you will record the interviews, and depending upon the type of interview, you may fill in a prepared form, use written notes, voice recorders, or computer-aided devices. After that, make a list of questions and test them with the sample of respondents. The questions must be aligned with the type of interview. If you are running structured interviews, then you should have a structured interview or structured questions and the structured guide with you. After that, it is important to decide who will conduct the interviews. For this, develop an information kit that includes the introduction to the research topic and instructions. For unstructured interviews, researcher may hire skilled interviewers. Next, During the interview, some points have to be noted, such as introduce yourself and initiate a friendly but professional conversation. After that, explain the purpose of the research or project. Then, the importance of the participation of the respondents and expected duration of the interview. Next, be prepared to reschedule the interview if a respondent has a problem with the timing. Next, explain the format of the interview that will assist the respondent to respond. After that, you can tell respondents how the interview will be recorded and how the collected information will be used. If possible, obtain their written consent to participate. After that, ask respondents if they have any questions and control your tone of voice and language. It should remain as neutral as possible when asking questions or probing on issues. After that, keep the focus on the topic of inquiry and complete the interview within the agreed time limit. After that, ensure proper recording as without distracting the respondent, check the notes or the voice recorder regularly. After that, complete the session and make sure all questions were asked. Explain again how you will use the data. Thank the respondent and ask them if they have any questions. After the interview also, you should follow certain important steps, such as make sure the interview was properly recorded, make additional notes if possible, organize your interview responses, such as responses from unstructured and semi-structured interviews need to be transcribed. Responses from structured interviews need to be entered into a data analysis program. After that, get ready for data analysis. Search for resources for analyzing qualitative and quantitative data. Dear friends, let us discuss about certain ethical issues in conducting interviews. Ethical issues are major concerns in the interviews, such as there should be confidentiality that should be given. The confidentiality or privacy of respondents is very important, and they should be properly explained about the responses which have been given, that for what purpose they will be used without losing the confidentiality. Explain the purpose to the respondent, and it should be explained in a proper and decent manner. Always promise and reciprocity. State what our respondents will be given. Always do the risk assessment. Consider in what ways might the interview put the respondent at the risk in terms of stress, legal liabilities, or political repercussion. Confidentiality is also important. Reflect on the extent to which promises of confidentiality can be met. It means you know but will not tell. Anonymity means you do not know, as in a survey returned anonymously. Inform the consent. With regard to data access and ownership, evaluate who has the right to access data and for what purpose. Also, think about mental health. Consider how interviewer and interviewee mental health may be affected by conducting the interview. After that, advise means appoint advisor on ethical matters during the course of the study. And also keep in mind the data collection boundaries. How hard will you push for the data? What length will you go in trying to gain access to data you want? What won't you do? How hard will you push interviewees to respond to questions about which they show some discomfort? When an interview has been completed and is considered a good interview, the respondents ought to know more about themselves and their situation. However, the researcher must remember that the purpose of research is to collect data and not to change the respondents or their opinions. Dear students, interviews are one of the way of data collection and gain knowledge from interviews. This type of interview, the type of interview to conduct will depend upon the objectives of the research. We have discussed 4 different types of interviews such as structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews and non-directive interviews. And depending upon the situations and the type of studies, we can use these methods depending upon the type of the studies, and also we should keep in mind the ethical issues which we discussed should be considered while conducting a smooth research. Thank you very much.